Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon. Excited to have you all here. I know folks are trickling in. This is a fantastic program day, one I was so excited to be part of because we are covering the globe here. We have an audience in the US and an audience in the UK and Europe. So we're talking today about sowing the marketing seeds for a life after coronavirus. New seeds are more of the same. The format here is going to be different and one I'm excited about. My friend Max Stricker at MountainView is going to walk us through a myths and facts presentation, give us a sense for what brands are doing during the crisis and how consumers are reacting to brand activity, give us some real evidence. And so he'll go through some myths and dispel them and give us the real facts on the ground. And what's exciting is that we have Neville Tam and David Cost, who will pipe in, share their opinions. They see it and live it every day. Nev is head of Salomon marketing at Amer Sports Corporation. David being the VP of digital and e-commerce at Rainbow Apparel. So this is all very much their day-to-day since COVID hit. And so it'll be great to get the back and forth, give Max an opportunity to share some of his scientific evidence, get David and Nev's opinions, and then open it up to Q&A and audience Q&A. Before we jump into Max's presentation, just wanted to give you a quick word on Landmark. Landmark, we're based in New York, been around for over 20 years now, which is hard to believe. We are a deal-making platform. We bring people together. We drive deal flow, business outcomes, synergies, and we do it in 3 different ways within the platform. We have an investment bank. We do M&A. We do equity side fundraising and some debt placement. We do events, both in person, although those are paused for the time being, and a lot of virtual ones this year, both small scale and large scale. And so we look forward to hosting you all again virtually and in person, hopefully in 2021. And then where I sit at Landmark is in our business development practice. We play as a intermediary or gatekeeper between growth stage emerging tech and great brands like Rainbow and like Salomon. So great to have everyone here. Excited to partner with Max and the MountainView team on this. I think there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to dig into. So let me kick it over to Max to get started with his presentation.
Thank you, Scott. So I hope we've overcome the first technical hurdle and you all can see my presentation. So hey there, my name is Max. I'm a brand director at MountainView. I don't need to introduce the coronavirus situation because we've all been living through it for the last 6 or so months. But what I want to talk to you about today is 3 marketing myths that have really caused a lot of debates in our industry over the last few months, and also have been subject to a lot of articles being written in the marketing press. And what I really want to do is look at those myths and compare them to the evidence. And why is that so important? Because as marketers, as business and brand owners, we make decisions every single day, and those decisions are influenced by our beliefs, the assumptions that we hold. And those in return influence the strategies that we focus on, the actions we take, and subsequently the results that we get. So we want to make sure that what we do is based on the evidence, based on the science, and not based on assumptions and myths. And that's basically what we do at MountainView. We replace myths with evidence. We are quite simply a team of marketers, scientists, and researchers, and we help our brand clients improve the effectiveness of the marketing. In simple words, getting more bang for their buck. We've also contributed to the seminal marketing evidence book, How Brands Grow, and we are long-standing partners of the University College London, which is Europe's largest psychology faculty. So in terms of our clients, we work predominantly with CPG clients, but also automotive, banking, insurance, technology, and so on and so forth. And what's really interesting when you work with such a large variety of clients is to see that actually quite a large number of decisions are based on myths and not on the science and evidence. And that's probably the reasons why we see some brands doing really well in terms of their customer acquisition cost, having very low customer acquisition costs, and some other brands not doing so well, having to spend a lot more for the same customer. And what we find is that the difference that's driving that is really down to the evidence and the data that's available to brands and how they make decisions, whether it's the myths or the science and the evidence. So let's jump straight into the first myth of today. I'm sure you've heard that some of the brands have really benefited from COVID and seen an influx of buyers joining their brands. And if we believe the marketing press, now really is the time to focus on loyalty and retention strategies. And we're not surprised to see that, because actually when we've spoken to marketeers over the last few years, that's something we keep hearing, that the majority of them actually believe that it's much easier to retain an existing buyer than to acquire a new one. And logically, if we think about it, that actually makes sense, right? Of course, those people who already buy our brand, it's easier to talk to them and get them to buy our brand again and more often, rather than going out there and getting someone to our brand that maybe never heard of it before, never bought it. However, if we look at the evidence, what we can clearly see here is that all brands lose buyers, all brands lose shoppers from one period to another, whether that's banking, automotive, insurance, technology, it doesn't matter. In CPG, for example, what you can see here is 60% of customers leave a brand from one year to another. That's an incredibly high number. Those people who bought your brand last year are no longer buying you this year, not even once. And we've also seen no evidence that loyalty strategies can improve the retention rate for brands. What we have seen though in the evidence is that retention and loyalty is actually predictable. And that's something I want to share with you in terms of the evidence and data now. This is an example from the shampoo category. What you see on the left-hand side is the year-on-year customer retention. And on the horizontal axis, you see the penetration, how many shoppers a brand holds on to. On the left-hand side, how many brands a shopper has. On the left-hand side, you see not many brands. On the right-hand side, you see a brand having a lot of shoppers. So if I now add the data in, what we can very clearly see is that there's a strong relationship between customer retention and penetration. If we look at the R-squared, which is measuring the strength of the relationship between those two metrics, we can see it's almost perfect. What this means is that retention is a function of penetration and less so a function of any loyalty strategies. Because if loyalty strategies really had a significant impact on the retention levels that brands see, we wouldn't see that very strong and clear pattern. And we've seen this across thousands of brands and hundreds of categories. This is an example from the US mobile phone category. No prizes there to guess where Apple sits. Apple is one of those brands that I constantly hear about, oh, they're having very high loyalty. They are being loved beyond reason. And that's factually correct. They have very high loyalty, particularly in the US. But they have high loyalty because they're also the biggest brand in the market. They're having the highest user base. So again, what we're seeing is retention is a function of brand size. And the reason why we're seeing this pattern is because those larger brands tend to have more distribution points and tend to be thought more often in purchasing situation. Hence, they're more likely to be repurchased versus smaller brands. So this is the situation when we look at year-on-year retention before COVID. So the question now is how, if at all, is that changing when we look at COVID-specific data? So what I'm going to do now is I look at data from the last 3 months, and we're going to check how many shoppers are repurchasing and staying loyal to a brand, buying a brand more than once. And once again, we're seeing the same strong pattern, that those brands that are bigger in the market actually hold on to more buyers. And this is an example from the household cleaning category. So again, the learning of retention is a function of penetration and less so of loyalty strategies. That holds true even during the COVID period that we are facing now. So it also brings up a question of what's the role then of retention in terms of driving the growth, the share growth of my brand. And I want to look at 5 examples here from around the world to really show you how universal that finding is. So when we see a brand is growing market share, we are not seeing this being driven by customer retention. There's hardly any or no impact at all. What we're seeing though, on the other hand, is that those brands who grow sales and who grow market share, they do so by recruiting more buyers to their brand. And we call this penetration is king. Brands grow when they recruit more buyers. And we've seen this pattern thousands of times that we can very comfortably say that this is an empirical generalization that holds true for virtually all brands and all categories and markets out there. So in terms of the learning for the first myth, we've seen that every brand is losing shoppers from one period to another, and that churn is actually predictable because bigger brands hold on to more buyers. For us as marketers, what does it mean? That means in terms of our actions, our focus, we probably shouldn't focus as much on loyalty strategies and really focus on reaching more buyers, being more inclusive in terms of reaching all the buyers within our category. Because actually the best retention strategy is an acquisition strategy. And on that note, over to you, Scott.
Yeah, let's go to our panelists to get immediate reactions. Maybe we go age before beauty and start with David. David, let's hear your take and how you've seen this all play out in the last few months, and if it aligns with some of the facts here that Max presented.
I mean, look, we don't, I think loyalty programs are very difficult to make financially work. But, you know, repeat purchases are what drive our business. When we do new customer acquisition, if we want to do it profitably, we can't do it on just one sale. So it's really important that a large group of those first-time buyers buy a second time. So how do we do that, right? I mean, it's all the communication we do once we get someone new to come to the website and introduce them to the brand. It's what we do to keep the brand top of mind. So it's email, SMS, push notifications, social media. It's a constant program of putting our content in front of, you know, these users to continue to keep the brand top of mind. Keeping the brand top of mind increases the probability that we're going to get future sales.
Kick it over to the UK. Nev, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my industry, the product life cycle, it can be much longer than a year. So it's certainly not effective to retarget those who've recently purchased. So penetration really is king, and I totally agree with that. I think when it comes to like the activation, when we say, for example, buying paid media, it's so much better to target wide and see which shoppers engage with your comms at that point in time. We cannot presume that those consumers are in shopper mode and that they're ready to make their next purchase. So that would totally be in line with the idea of focusing on penetration rather than on repeat purchase.
So we're all pretty much in agreement on Max's first finding.
That's good to know.
I've got a point which might be the same, might be different. So I think when you're a large brand, so say in trail running, Salomon's like one of the global leading brands. And so we feel we have to do a category job. And as a result of COVID, there's been new people who've come into that category of running. So it is of benefit to us to keep people engaged in the market, in the category of being in the sport. And so it may be less kind of product conversion focus, but in terms of education and the benefits of trail run and getting people engaged in the community. So it's more the softer measures. We feel that there is a role to play to help retain people in the market itself.
Should we go on to myth and fact number 2?
Sounds good. So the second myth I want to touch on today is that assumption that as advertisers or brand owners, we need to take a stand during the COVID crisis. What does taking a stand mean? It could mean a variety of things, such as like developing COVID-specific advertising, talking about COVID in my content, or also talking about purpose, dialing purpose up a lot more, as we've heard from a lot of brands as well. But the first misconception here really is that we believe we need to develop different advertising now during the COVID period versus before. But actually, when we look at the research, what we can see is that those ads that performed well before COVID are still performing well now. And vice versa, those that didn't perform well are still not performing well now, which is good news for some of the brands who potentially don't have deep pockets at the moment, because they don't necessarily have to go out there and develop new communications. But still, what we've seen, particularly at the beginning of the COVID crisis, was that a lot of brands decided to develop new advertising. It almost feels like they all had the same brief and the same agency that worked on it, because we ended up with that sea of sameness. And I'm sure that's something our audience has come across as well, that the look and feel of the advertising looked very, very similar. Typically, it's starting off with very slow music, showing empty stadiums, empty streets, empty playgrounds, and finishing off with some messages around like, we're still there for you and we'll get through it together. But they're all like wallpaper, because they're all falling foul basically on 2 fundamental hurdles of effective communications. And that is getting attention and making sure that our brand is recognized. Getting attention means if people don't pay attention to our advertising, to our communication, nothing else really matters. And if people don't recognize that it's us who is communicating, why even communicate? Particularly worrisome if we think that they might confuse our ad with a competitor. So let me just spend another few moments on those 2 points, because I think they're really, really important. So I'm sure you've all heard about the attention economy, and it probably goes without saying that attention is probably the biggest challenge, the biggest obstacle that we as marketers, communicators face at the moment. We just need to look at some research from Nielsen, for example, who say 3/4 of people don't remember the content of advertising just the very next day. But it actually doesn't come as a surprise, because we know from eye tracking that offline ads are often not even noticed and seen. And if we thought that the digital, the online world will save us, well, actually it's even worse there. We can see that about 90% of viewable ads by consumer. So it really is the biggest challenge that we have and that we need to overcome. But it's not just that, it's also about making sure that people know it is us who is advertising, that they recognize our brand, and it doesn't look like the sea of sameness we've just heard a moment ago. And that sea of sameness is actually not something new that's just come out with the corona crisis. We've seen this over many years and across a number of different categories. And it's really those brands who understand the importance of distinctiveness, who understand the importance of being instantly recognized, who will come out on top, who will come out as winners on that. Because our role, one of our roles as marketers, really is to make our brand instantly recognizable. That be in the communication that we send out, but also in terms of our product at point of sale, be it in physical stores or online. We want to make sure that people instantly recognize our brand. But very often, actually, brand owners fail that very important hurdle. And for example, we've seen a lot of brands changing the packaging or changing the advertising, and then it makes it very difficult for consumers to recognize actually who the brand is that's communicating. I'm pretty sure that most of you will recognize the 6 brands shown here, even though you don't see the entire brand and the brand name is not there. This is because those brands use what we call distinctive brand assets. These are basically mental associations that we as consumers use to recognize, remember, and identify a brand, whether that's in communication or at point of sale. And it's our role as marketers, as brand owners, to, on the one hand, establish those associations in consumers' minds, but on the other hand, we also need to strengthen them through consistency over time. And these are questions that we regularly discuss with our clients around the world. What are the associations in your consumers' minds, and how strong are these associations? And what we really see is that those brands that understand the importance of distinctiveness, they really can see a transformation in their creative effectiveness. Like this short case study shows of one of our clients. They've reintroduced a distinctive asset that they hadn't been using for many years, and their creative effectiveness increased significantly. The ad recall improved, and the brand recall as well. It wasn't just the creative effectiveness which saw an improvement, which was great, but also overall they saw a significant increase in the terms of their marketing effectiveness, the ROI that they've seen in marketing. So in terms of myth number 2, we've not seen in the evidence that we actually need to change our advertising and develop COVID-specific advertising. We've also not seen that the fundamentals of effective communications, i.e. getting attention and making sure we're instantly recognized, have changed. That means though,
sorry, Max.
Oh, that means though, if we as brand owners still want to change it, we can do it. However, we need to still make sure that we focus on attention and on recognition. The good news is for those brands who don't have deep pockets, and there are some of them out there who basically had to cut back significantly on their spend, that you potentially can still use the advertising that you created before the crisis and still use it now.
So let's get immediate reactions and start with Nev first.
Yeah, I mean, the view is that if your shopper decision hierarchy for a particular product hasn't changed as a result of COVID, then there's no reason for you to falter and change your comm strategy. And especially if your communication is representing particular assets to drive your brand equity, you should feel very tread very carefully if you're going to be changing those as a result of a topical, newsworthy topic for today, however big it is with COVID. But the key message I'm taking away, I think, is what are my brand's distinctive assets? And I'm asking that for myself on the brand of Salomon. In the previous role, worked on a repositioning and a resultant pack redesign on a traditional British pudding brand called Angel Delight, part of Premier Foods. And I think the research was really key in dispelling, again, myths over what we thought our distinctive assets were, and helped identify through blurred out packaging that light and fluffy clouds were that distinctive asset. So it seems so random, but the end of it meant that we went into a new usage occasion adjacency, we redesigned the packaging, and we turned around from double-digit decline to 40% sales growth, and a whole new line. And it was a change in thinking as a result of robust research into identifying what those distinctive assets were. So it can be really important.
David, curious to get your take on all this from a retail angle, because a lot of this has been built or spoken to from a brand perspective, but how have you confronted engaging your audience during COVID, and have you changed it up a little bit, or kind of just stay true to your brand core value through and through?
We didn't really make any changes at all. Same things that worked for us before, we continued to do. We sell fast fashion. I think if anything, we were a respite, or the customer could come shop and escape for a little bit. We didn't really want to preach or lecture or make them dwell on doom and gloom. So we kept doing the same things that made us successful before. We continued those during and through to today.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of that, meaning being authentic doesn't mean being empathetic. Being authentic means being true to what your brand does, because that's what consumers rely on, and that's what they come to expect. So you didn't throw them any curveballs over the last 4 months. You just given them what they expect.
I mean, we're a place to come buy fashion, right? So, we want to give them, what they're coming here for. They're not coming to Rainbow for health advice, right? So we want to continue to show them, what the latest fashion looks like. Let them escape a little bit, and and give them some normalcy.
So before we kick it to Max for myth and fact number 3, I just want to remind the audience that we'll try to carve out a few minutes for audience Q&A. So feel free to use the Zoom chat function to send over your questions, and we'll try to get to a handful of them before we all sign off. But Max, take it away.
Yeah, actually, before I move on to the third myth, I just want to comment on what Nev and David said. I think it's very important because, as I said, one of the roles that we have as marketers is about building those mental associations. And one of the important things in order to do that is to use those associations consistently over time, but also across the different channels. And if we keep chopping changing that, we're trying to build a lot of different associations. So it makes it very difficult for consumers actually to understand what is our brand, like how do I identify that brand? And we keep seeing examples, whether that's packaging or whether that's advertising. Particularly advertising is such an interesting area of debate, because it almost feels like that us as marketeers and advertisers, we get bored of communication much quicker, much sooner than the normal person. But actually there isn't any evidence that we've ever come across that ad wear out actually exists. We see advertising on a daily basis, right? We see ours, our competitors, and other ones as well, just for comparison, because we want to learn from them. Our consumers, they have a lot of other things to do. Advertising is not something that I would argue the vast majority of them do as a hobby. So we need to bear that in mind as well. Have that consistency and have that simplicity, because it really builds those associations that can help us over time. So I really applaud all the brands who are sticking to the guns at the moment and saying, like, this is how we communicated before, and we're still using our distinctive asset. It doesn't mean you can't make any changes at all. Of course you can, but make sure that people still pay attention to it and they still know that it's you who's communicating. So shy away from potentially making wholesale changes. So in terms of the third myth, this is a super interesting one, because it comes from the assumption that actually I shouldn't show any communication, I shouldn't show any of my brand advertising next to COVID related content. And what happened here was, particularly in the US and the UK, but also other countries around the world, was that advertisers said, well, actually, you know what? I don't want my brand to be shown next to certain keywords around COVID, so I'm gonna blacklist that piece of article, for example. And as you can imagine, that caused a lot of outcry for publishers because they saw an impact on their income. In the UK, it was reported that publishers are missing out on £50 million of sales. In the UK, in the US, the New York Times said that they are forecasting to lose 10% of the digital income just because advertisers decided not to show their ads next to COVID-related content. And obviously publishers then came together. They were also supported by some other industry bodies to really change the perception of advertisers. In the UK, even the government joined that call for arms to say, please don't do that anymore. It's really harming the industry. And it was quite interesting to read some research from a company called GumGum, artificial intelligence company. What they did was they looked at 7 million web pages with COVID content and analyzed them for different keywords, and actually found that the vast majority, 60%, absolutely fine for brands to use. We shouldn't worry too much about advertising on those websites, which is obviously very good news for publishers. But those who stopped doing that, they potentially have missed out on a big opportunity. And that's something that we can also see when we look at eye tracking. This is a really interesting study that was done by Lumen that looked at newspaper advertising and found that those ads who sit in closer proximity to COVID content are more likely to get higher attention than those who don't. Actually, the team is currently replicating this analysis and this study for digital ads specifically. The results, unfortunately, are not out. My personal assumption is to expect something very similar, but we'll see when the data comes out. But what you can see, hopefully, on this chart here is on the bottom right corner, there's this red box. It's a coronavirus info box that gets a lot of eyeballs. You can see that by the red heat map. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that it gets a lot of eyeballs, because as consumers, we read newspapers for information purposes. And if something is relevant, of interest to us, we're going to look at that. So the two ads, Samsung and Vodafone, on this page, if they were closer to that info box on coronavirus, they probably would perform a lot better in terms of getting attention. And this is something I really want to advocate, that we don't have to worry too much about where we show our content in terms of COVID. The same situation, actually, you might be interesting to hear, is happened for Black Lives Matter, where again, a lot of content was blacklisted for very similar reasons. As consumers, we look at newspapers, magazines, and we watch TV for entertainment and educational purposes, right? So if that's what we do as consumers, it's only the right thing for us as advertisers to say, this is where we want to be, because that helps us get attention. And we've hopefully seen earlier on how important attention is for us as advertisers. What we really need to focus on is how do we stand out in the context, that COVID context that we are, and how do we make sure that people, as I said earlier, recognize that it is us who is communicating.
Really interesting. David, I'll give you the first swing at that one.
Our primary channel for advertising is social media. And in social media, we don't really have the, being next to COVID-19 articles isn't really an issue. So this doesn't really apply to the kind of advertising that we're really doing right now.
Neb, do you want to take a swing at it? Any interesting findings for you guys around this?
Sorry, were you asking me? Apologies, I missed my name there.
Sorry, yeah, I was asking you if you found any interesting findings around this and ad placement and either shying away from current events or just embedding yourselves.
Yeah, I think if anything, I would be comfortable with the potential traffic that current news topics such as COVID can attract. So I think trusting in Google Display Network or Yahoo for paid media, giving them free rein to serve your ad without blocks or restrictions can lead to more efficient cost per conversion in my eyes. And then when whether you're a retailer or a brand, and when you're looking at social media channels, particular hashtags can have huge numbers of followers and potentially an opportunity to reach people that otherwise might not be interacting with your content. So definitely wouldn't necessarily shy away from it. No.
So we have about 15 minutes left, which is great. And Max, thank you for taking us through that presentation. Great findings, and feel free to share that out with the group that's listening in afterwards. I want to ask you guys a few questions, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A as well. But first, before I do that, any immediate reactions overall, thoughts that, David or Nev, you wanted to share in response overall to the presentation? Anything that kind of popped in your head as you were listening to Max that you wanted to get across before we jump into Q&A?
I thought it was good common sense. I mean, I thought the slide showing the sameness of the ads was very striking. It was something I hadn't seen before. And I think that one will stick with me for a while.
So let's jump into a few questions, and we can start with you, Nev. Over the course of the last few months during the crisis, what was the single biggest challenge you faced, and what have you done to overcome that one thing? And I know there's probably a whole bunch of them, but if you can speak to one that really jumps off the page for you.
I'm sure others can relate to this as well. The single biggest issue has to try and remain consumer focused despite adverse conditions, budget cuts. In my industry, we certainly had all non-essential shops shut down, and therefore it had cash flow implications across the whole chain. So definitely felt like the business wanted to cut on marketing when it isn't necessarily the best thing to do from a consumer perspective. So it certainly was a challenge in lean and agile financial times to protect the business, yet stay salient in consumers' minds. And this really meant moving from paid to earned media and influencer marketing and other free forms, because that can still give you media share of voice without costing money. That definitely was a big challenge and something where we had to look to redistribute our non-existent funds in the short term, which thankfully now shops are opening are returning.
David, for you, anything that jumps off?
Look, I mean, the biggest challenge for us was physical fulfillment. I mean, if we looked at what our plan was for our e-commerce business, literally overnight, we jumped 5 years into the future. And you don't double fulfillment centers overnight in the middle of a pandemic. So, we had to quickly try to figure out how we could staff a second shift. How are you going to double the number of employees in your fulfillment center? Again, when most things are shut down. As we got that stood up, then we had inventory issues, right? So we're still primarily a brick and mortar retailer. We are distributed just like any other store is, even though we're the biggest store in the chain. But with our distribution center being closed, how are we going to get goods to e-com? Kind of in the middle of all this, fast forward to where we are now, we've doubled the capacity of the fulfillment center. We've doubled our capacity for inventory. We're back to a full strength advertising, right, to continue to grow the business. But a lot of those things are, we had a board that made investments right in the middle of the pandemic. We're very bullish on the business that put us in a position to do what we did. So I feel pretty fortunate because of that.
Max, I don't want to make you feel left out. So what was the biggest challenge you've had as you engage with all your brand partners?
The biggest challenge for us was not seeing anyone face to face, because we do a lot of trainings and workshops around the world, and not being able to do that. Everything is moved online now, like the webinar. So for us, that was probably the biggest challenge that we faced. But what I wanted to just comment on is like Neville's point earlier in terms of the budget cuts and having basically less money available, because that's something we've seen across a number of brands and number of clients around the world. And I think what we can really see is that those brands who have previously started to focus on like, what are the things that work, what are the things that don't work in terms of test and learn, focusing on the evidence and the science rather than just the assumptions. Those are the brands that are really benefiting and are likely to come out on top of this crisis, whenever this crisis may be over.
So we touched on this a bit, and David spoke to it a little bit. But David, maybe you can start and give us some more detail on your roadmap specific to marketing strategies. It sounds like you've stayed the course overall. Have there been places where you've doubled down or pulled back bets, or maybe things that you're planning to do over the next 4 to 6 months that might look different than how you were planning for, call it Q1 of 2020?
I mean, we had to pull back advertising during COVID only because our fulfillment infrastructure couldn't take any more business.
Good problem to have, huh?
Right. It's a very good problem to have, right? So there was no reason to buy more business when we had as much organic business as we could handle. As we've now kind of, built out that infrastructure, we're back to a full, social advertising program. And we're finding as people have dropped out, we're getting the best performance we ever have out of social media. So we are buying as much of it as we can. And, we've got comps that are just, that are spectacular. I mean, we've got triple digit comps. So,
are you seeing similar things? Obviously, maybe the inventory story is different, but there is a captive audience at home stuck to social media. It sounds like David and his team are taking advantage of it. Are you seeing something similar, or are you going about it differently?
Well, we're seeing that social media app usage has increased 20%, and like highest on record usage of like a quarter of their day in terms of consumers spending their time online. So that definitely impacted our strategy in terms of, also we can't do physical events, we can't do big face-to-face high engagement workshops on running or hiking, and we can't do big race events. So how are we going to get across that highly engaging event without being face-to-face? So social media definitely was an answer to that, leveraging influencers, creating video content, because we knew that people were looking for that sort of thing whilst they were locked down. And I think in a post-COVID world, adapting to new regulations, making sure that we can be safe, socially distanced, moving to small group activity, and a bigger weight on the online side of things in terms of the online shopper journey conversion. So knowing that the future of the balance of brick and mortar to e-tailers and online purchase is changing, and now's the time to step change that.
So we have about 8 minutes left. I want to be sensitive to everyone's day. I'm going to go to a couple of audience questions, and then we'll go around and do a parting shot for everybody. But some interesting questions have rolled in, and I'm going to read them here off my phone. One that kind of aligns with the question that we were planning on asking anyway, which is great. It seems that there are misconceptions and maybe wrong beliefs out there. Maybe Max, you can answer this, and we can go to everybody else. How do you explain the fact that, so many misconceptions have just flooded the market with brands all doing similar things that may not necessarily be the right thing?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I don't think it's something that's very recent. It's been going on probably for quite some time. I don't want to give away my age here, but I remember when I was still studying for my master's in marketing, there was still a lot of the likes of Kotler and Amer that people talked about. And it was all fine because what they said back then is we're basically writing down what we see marketers is doing. But what has happened over the last few decades actually is that the science and the data that's available has really caught up with a lot of these thinking, actually replaced that. For example, the thinking about how brands grow was initially found in the 60s, and only since 2010 when the book How Brands Grow came out, marketers started to take note of that. We've certainly seen the last few years that's happening. So I think there's still a lot happening at an educational university level that's impacting that. But also it's a typical thing about like, I'm joining a company and I keep doing what the company's always done. I keep doing what I've been told to do without necessarily challenging that. It certainly was true for my career when I worked with the likes of L'Oreal and Danone. If your line manager tells you we've always done that, we keep doing it, you just get on with it, right? It's almost this confirmation bias that you have. If everyone is saying that, the herd mentality, then we follow that as well. So I think from that point of view, the educational side, there's a bit of a challenge there, but also that we very often don't question actually the data that we look at. It's only, it feels to me like it's only recently that there's more challenges coming up where people say, okay, hold on a second, what's the data actually based on? So we are strong advocates of testing and learning. So every brand is a bit different. So always find out what works for you from that point of view.
David, Nev, any thoughts on that? Kind of how these myths get out there?
I agree with everything Max said. I mean, it's I guess it's easier to follow than to lead, and why people don't question more or dig in more or question just the fact that we did something in the past. Why do we do it in the future? I don't know. It puzzles me, but it makes the playing field a little easier. So I'll take it.
Nev, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly been in a position where we get questioned on why we're not following what a big competitor brand is doing. And the business wants you to have a knee-jerk reaction. Why shouldn't we be activating in that certain way as well without evidence? And even with research, it's so important that it's behavior-based and not just consumers' perceived response. And I think that makes a big difference on whether you think the consumer's behavior actually will change as a result of that action.
So a great question came in regarding Max's takeaway number 2 about grabbing attention. Someone asked, how important is it that marketing teams invest in a strong creative agency or internal creative team? How is that being considered into your budgets? Has that changed? So maybe take a minute, because we really haven't given a ton of attention to creative process and power. David, do you want to start with that?
You're cutting up. Were you addressing one of us?
Nope, I was addressing all of you. I figured someone would jump in.
Yeah, I mean, look, we use social to give us signals on that, right? So we're looking at user-generated content. What is grabbing people's attention? Strong creative, it's their guess, it's kind of their point of view. We kind of want to see, what's actually working. And by seeing what posts garner the most attention and the most engagement, we found that to be the single strongest signal in terms of where to go creatively.
Nev, go ahead.
In terms of social media, we invest in an influencer manager who's an internal headcount who manages, it's like a community manager, and they manage brand ambassadors who are external. By doing it that way, it allows you some flexibility to dial up and dial down to the year and the season of the budget, as well as the credibility of influencers or kind of recommendation from those in the community, often being quite a powerful endorsement in addition to your direct brand messages. Is that what's the question's referring to?
And curious also just in terms of creative power beyond social, how much are you allocating resource, time, money into your creative teams overall?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I work for an organization that's portfolio. So when you have many brands, you can often have the economy of scale to have specialists in-house, but there's definitely benefits if you're a single organization and a smaller to invest in specialist creative agencies. You get strategy and planning teams, account management, creative teams that are working across many accounts, and that can be really valuable to get their cross-industry expertise in their discipline. So yeah, I would certainly recommend that's a starting point.
So we have 2 minutes left, and I appreciate everyone sending in questions, but I want to give the panelists a chance to share a parting shot, one last thought before we say goodbye, and then hopefully I'll have a chance to do it again. So David, why don't we start with you? What can you share about the future or any other thought with the group before we sign off?
Geez, I thought about the future. I mean, look, I think we've, this fact that the calendar is really accelerated, really that we've jumped ahead in time. Is something it's an opportunity, or if you ignore it, I think you're going to pay a negative price for it. So trying to really, grasp what this means and what investments you need to make in order to be in a position to thrive, with what the new conditions are, that's what I would focus on.
Nev, go ahead. And thank you, David.
Yeah, I think in answer to Frank's question on CSR, COVID has changed how consumers are thinking about CSR. Doesn't mean you should change what your brand stands for, but every organization should have, as a hygiene factor, CSR in terms of diversity and inclusivity, sustainability and environmental factors, it's really important that you at least have a stance on it and a long-term strategy on how you're addressing it, because consumers are looking for it, but it isn't necessarily the key deciding factor for the purchase of a product.
Great. Max, we'll give you the last word, and I thank you again for organizing this great group, and go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to share my screen again. My parting comment really is challenge what you're being told. Look at it and really understand how does it stack up against the evidence that you have. And if there is no evidence, try and do some test and learn, right? Don't just accept what other people are saying. We've talked about 3 minutes today. The underlying question of today's session really was, should I as a marketer do things differently? And the very short and simplified answer is no. Like what we're seeing from the evidence, from the research, is that the fundamentals of how brands grow, the fundamentals of what makes for effective communication hasn't actually changed. We should still focus on recruitment. It's the best retention strategy. We should focus on getting attention and being instantly recognized, because otherwise nothing else matters. So that would be my parting call, to really focus on the science and the evidence, because this is where our clients really see the biggest results and improvements in their performance. And I just want to say one final thing. In case anyone questions after today's session, because I know we have time now, feel free to give me a shout on LinkedIn. I'm also happy to have a virtual coffee, which seems to be the new norm nowadays. But also, if anyone is interested in testing their marketing myth knowledge a little bit more, just go to our website at mountainview.co.uk. There's a very short quiz that you can take. And one of the questions on the quiz is actually what we've discussed today. So I would expect everyone to hopefully get that right.
That's great. Well, thank you to all the panelists. Thanks for everyone for joining. I hope that we can do this again, both virtually and then in person in 2021. For those of you in the UK, have a great evening. Cheers to you. And for those of us in the US, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
For joining.